If you ever climb Mount Merapi and see a glowing market above the clouds, run. High up on the slopes of Merapi, Indonesia's most dangerous active volcano, there is a place where the living and the dead cross paths. The locals call it Pasar Bubrah, a barren rocky plateau. Near the summit where trees refuse to grow and the wind sounds like a low, hollow groan. During the day, it is just a desolate expanse of gray dust and sharp volcanic rock. But when midnight falls and the thick mountain fog rolls in, a bustling supernatural night market materializes out of thin air. Lanterns flicker in the mist. Shadow figures move between wooden stalls, and the air fills with the overwhelming scent of sweet jasmine mixed with burning sulfur. Climbers are warned from the moment they step foot on the mountain. If you hear the faint sound of gamelan music drifting through the cold night, do not follow it. If you see bright lights where there should only be darkness, turn off your flashlight and sit still. And above all, no matter how tired, hungry, or curious you are, never buy anything from the vendors at the ghost market, because in the world of the spirits, payment is never made with cash. The story begins with two experienced mountaineers from Jakarta, Maya and Rio. They were seasoned hikers who had conquered dozens of peaks across Southeast Asia, but they were always looking for their next big adventure. They had heard the whispers about Merapi's Phantom Market, but like most modern travelers, they brushed it off as mere local superstition, a clever myth designed to keep tourists on the marked trails. Rio was particularly skeptical. He carried a high-end camera setup, determined to capture footage of the volcano at sunrise, to share with thousands of followers online. He wanted a story that would go viral, but he had no idea that the mountain was about to give him exactly what he wished for in the terrifyingest way possible. They started their ascent late in the evening from the Selo hiking post. The night was unusually clear at first, the moon casting a silver glow over the rugged terrain. Their headlamps cut through the darkness as they pushed higher and higher, the air growing colder and thinner with every step. By 11 o'clock, they reached the approach to Pasar Bubrah. The weather shifted with unnatural speed. Within minutes, a heavy, suffocating mist blanketed the path, swallowing the moonlight and reducing their visibility to just a few feet. Their compasses began to spin erratically, and the GPS on Rio's phone lost signal completely. Rio paused, shining his torch into the impenetrable fog. The temperature dropped drastically, far colder than it should have been for that elevation. Then, through the heavy silence of the night, they heard it, a soft, rhythmic clinking sound, followed by the distant, hypnotic melody of traditional Javanese gongs. Maya froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered the warning the local guide had given them at the base of the mountain. She grabbed Rio's arm, telling him they needed to stop, set up their tent immediately, and wait for sunrise. But Rio was mesmerized. The sound wasn't coming from below. It was coming from right in front of them, deeper inside the fog. Against Maya's desperate pleas, Rio took a step forward into the mist. As if answering his movement, the fog parted like a heavy curtain, revealing a scene that defied all human logic. They were standing at the edge of a massive, crowded marketplace. Rows of bamboo stalls stretched out into the darkness, illuminated by the warm, flickering light of oil lamps. Hundreds of figures walked through the narrow aisles, dressed in traditional Javanese batik robes. But there was something deeply wrong with the crowd. None of the figures made a sound. Hundreds of feet shuffled across the gravel, yet there was complete, eerie silence, save for the hypnotic music drifting from somewhere unknown. When the light from the oil lamps caught the faces of the shoppers and vendors, Rio felt his blood run cold. Their skin was pale gray, their eyes hollow, and their movements stiff, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Maya tried to pull Rio back, but he was frozen in place, paralyzed by a mixture of sheer terror and morbid fascination. Suddenly, a figure behind one of the nearest stalls turned directly toward them. It was an elderly woman wearing a dark batik wrap, her face deeply lined and her pale, milky eyes staring straight through them. On her wooden table sat a collection of strange, beautiful antiques, carved brass daggers, ancient silver coins, and polished volcanic stones that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. The old woman smiled, revealing dark, blackened teeth, and gestured for them to come closer. Her voice echoed directly inside their minds, smooth and deceptively welcoming. inviting them to take a keepsake from the mountain. She told them that anyone who carries a token from Merapi will be granted safe passage and endless good fortune. Rio, still in a trance-like state, stepped toward the stall. His hands trembled as his eyes locked onto a small, intricate brass ring carved in the shape of a coiled dragon. The craftsmanship was exquisite, unlike anything he had ever seen. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stack of paper currency, and laid it on the wooden table. The old woman chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that made the hairs on the back of Maya's neck stand up. She gently pushed the money back toward Rio with a thin, pale finger. She whispered that the physical currency of the living had no value in her realm. Instead, she asked for something far simpler, a simple trade, a single drop of blood, or a tiny personal item that held deep emotional value. She looked at Rio's camera strap, then at a silver medallion Rio wore around his neck, a gift given to him by his late grandfather. Before Maya could scream at him to stop, Rio unclasped the medallion and placed it on the table. The old woman's grin widened, her milky eyes flashing with a predatory light. She quickly scooped up the medallion, her cold, bone-dry fingers brushing against Rio's palm. She picked up the brass dragon ring and handed it to him. The moment the metal touched Rio's skin, a sharp, searing pain shot up his arm, as if the ring were made of burning coals. He dropped the ring onto the dirt, gasping for air as his vision blurred. In that exact instant, the hypnotic atmosphere of the market shattered. The sweet scent of jasmine instantly turned into the suffocating stench of rotting flesh and fresh blood. The soft music turned into a chorus of agonizing wails and shrieks that echoed off the volcanic rocks. The flickering oil lamps flared with bright green flames, revealing the true form of the market's inhabitants. They were not peaceful villagers in traditional clothing. They were twisted, horrifying entities with torn limbs, sunken faces, and skin charred black by volcanic fire. The crowd of spirits stopped, moving and turned as one single unit toward the two intruders. Hundreds of hollow, glowing eyes locked onto Maya. Rio, the old woman, at the stall collapsed into a pile of black ash, and from the dirt where the brass ring had fallen, long, dark tendrils of smoke began to rise, wrapping around Rio's ankles like living chains. He fell to his knees, screaming in agony as he felt an unbearable weight pulling him down toward the earth, as if the mountain itself was trying to swallow him whole. Maya panicked. Driven by pure instinct and terror, she grabbed Rio under his arms and pulled with all her strength. She screamed his name over and over, fighting against the invisible force that was dragging him down. She remembered another detail from the mountain's folklore. Spirits of the volcano cannot cross the line of wild salt or step onto sacred ground. But more importantly, they feed on fear and compliance. By accepting a trade, Rio had given the entity permission to claim his soul. Desperate, Maya reached into Rio's pocket, grabbed the stack of money he had tried to use earlier, and threw it into the air toward the approaching horde of shadow figures. As the paper bills scattered in the wind, the entities hesitated for a brief second, distracted by the disruption. Using that split second, Maya kicked the brass ring away into the darkness and yanked Rio backward with every ounce of power left in her body. The moment the ring left their immediate vicinity, the hold on Rio snapped. He gasped, lunging forward as the smoke dissolved. Without looking back, Maya dragged Rio up, and they sprinted frantically into the blinding mist. Behind them, the air was filled with enraged, unnatural screeches as the market entities realized their prey was escaping. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, loose rocks cascading down the slope as Merapi expressed its wrath. They ran blindly through the fog, tripping over sharp volcanic stones, scraping their hands and knees, completely lost in the dark. Every direction looked the same, and the terrifying sounds of the market seemed to echo from all around them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive boulder as the first light of dawn began to crack across the eastern horizon. As the sunlight pierced through the clouds, the thick fog evaporated into thin air. The terrifying screeches vanished, replaced once again by the quiet, howling mountain wind. When Maya and Rio looked around, they were sitting in the middle of Pasar Bubrah, but there were no stalls, no lanterns, and no crowds. There was only a vast, empty field of gray volcanic rock and sharp boulders. Rio sat on the cold ground, pale, shivering, and covered in sweat. His grandfather's silver medallion was gone forever, and on the palm of his hand, where he had touched the dragon ring, a dark, permanent scar had formed in the exact shape of a coiled serpent. They hiked down the mountain in complete silence, never speaking a word to the other climbers they passed along the trail. Rio never posted the footage from that night. When he checked his high-end camera back at the base camp, every single digital file recorded after midnight was corrupted, showing nothing but static and a faint, terrifying outline of a smiling old woman staring through the lens. To this day, local guides at Mount Merapi still tell the story to anyone who dares to climb the peak at night. They remind travelers that the volcano is a living, breathing realm with its own ancient rules. The ghost market still appears whenever the mist rolls in at midnight, waiting for unsuspecting travelers who are curious enough to wander off the path. The stalls are always open, the goods are always alluring, and the vendors are always willing to make a deal. But if you ever find yourself standing in that misty plateau, listening to the faint sound of gamelan music in the dark, remember Rio's scar. Keep your head down, keep your hands in your pockets, and whatever you do, never buy anything from the market above the clouds. Deep inside the ancient rainforests of Borneo, there is a creature that hunts not for meat, but for the life force of the living. The island of Borneo holds some of the oldest jungles on planet Earth, a dense, uncharted wilderness, where sunlight barely touches the muddy ground and modern civilization feels thousands of miles away. For generations, the indigenous tribes who live along the winding rivers have spoken in hushed tones about the Kuyang, a terrifying entity born from dark witchcraft. By day, she appears as an ordinary, soft-spoken woman living among the villagers. But when night falls, her head detaches from her shoulders, dragging her glowing, dripping internal organs through the humid air as she flies through the canopy in search of fresh blood. Most people believe the Kuyang is just a campfire story designed to keep children from wandering into the dark. A group of 4 American travel vloggers thought the exact same thing, until they decided to venture into a forbidden stretch of the Kalimantan jungle to prove the legend was real. The group was led by Mark, an ambitious content creator obsessed with chasing viral thriller videos, along with his girlfriend Sarah and 2 close friends, Leo and Maya. They had built a massive online following by exploring haunted locations, abandoned military bunkers, and sacred ruins across the globe. But Mark wanted something bigger, a video that would break the internet and cement their channel in YouTube history. When he came across obscure forum posts detailing recent sightings of a floating, severed head deep in the forests of Indonesian Borneo, he knew he had found his holy grail. They packed heavy camera equipment, thermal imaging gear, satellite phones, and hired a reluctant local guide named Pak Aris, a seasoned river navigator who agreed to take them upriver on one condition. They would turn back the moment he felt the jungle shift. The journey began on a narrow wooden riverboat, cutting through murky green waters flanked by towering ancient trees. As they traveled deeper into the interior, the ambient sounds of civilization vanished entirely, replaced by the deafening hum of cicadas and the distant calls of hornbills. By the 3rd day, they reached a region that wasn't marked on any modern GPS map. Paris stopped the boat near an overgrown riverbank, lined with tall, jagged wooden poles carved with tribal warnings. He pointed toward a dense ridge shrouded in perpetual mist, telling them that beyond that line lay the territory of a forgotten tribe, where a practitioner of black magic had performed a forbidden, immortal ritual centuries ago. He warned them that the spirits still hunted the canopy every full moon, and that night the moon would be fully exposed. Mark laughed off the warning, flashing his expensive night vision cameras to the camera lens and assuring their future viewers that they were completely safe. Paaris refused to step foot on the land, choosing instead to anchor the boat in the middle of the river and promising to wait until sunrise. Though his eyes were wide with genuine terror, ignoring his pleas, the 4 friends strapped on their backpacks, turned on their headlamps, and pushed through the razor-sharp ferns into the thick, dark jungle. At first, the hike was simply exhausting. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel heavy, and the ground was a treacherous mud trap filled with hidden roots. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere changed drastically. The chorus of night insects suddenly stopped, plunging the rainforest into a heavy, suffocating silence. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving the air completely still. Leo, who was operating the thermal camera, called everyone over in a panicked whisper. He pointed the screen toward the upper tree canopy. A bright heat signature was hovering about 30 feet above the ground, perfectly stationary between two massive mahogany trees. Sarah nervously suggested it might just be a large fruit bat or an owl, but as Leo zoomed in, the thermal shape began to drift downward slowly, defying gravity. Mark adjusted his main camera lens, shining a high-powered tactical flashlight directly toward the heat signature. What the beam revealed instantly paralyzed all four of them with pure, unadulterated horror. Floating in midair was the head of a woman with long, matted black hair that drifted around her like tentacles. Her skin was a sickly, bruised purple. Her eyes were solid, milky white with no pupils, and her mouth was stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth dripping with dark saliva. But the most horrifying part was what hung beneath her severed neck. Suspended in open air were her heart, lungs, stomach, and intestines, glowing with a faint, greenish, bioluminescent light, pulsing rhythmically as if they were still pumping blood inside a living body. The creature hovered silently above them, her exposed organs swaying in the night air like the tentacles of a deep-sea jellyfish. A stench of iron, rotting meat, and burning sulfur instantly washed over the group, so powerful that Maya gagged and fell to her knees. For a few agonizing seconds, no one moved, no one breathed, and the camera light stayed locked on the floating monstrosity. Then the creature opened its jaws even wider and emitted a high-pitched, piercing shriek that echoed through the dark woods, a sound so loud and shrill that it felt like hot needles piercing their eardrums. The spell of shock broke and chaos erupted. Mark screamed for everyone to run, dropping his primary tripod as they turned and sprinted blindly through the dense vegetation. Behind them, they could hear the sickening sound of wet organs slapping against the tree, trunks and leaves as the entity glided through the air with terrifying speed. The Kuyang was not just following them, she was hunting them, weaving effortlessly between the massive trunks high above their heads, her glowing intestines leaving an eerie green trail in the darkness. Maya tripped over an exposed tree root, crashing heavily into the mud and twisting her ankle. Before Leo could reach down to help her, a gust of foul-hot wind blew down from the canopy. The severed head descended like a bird of prey, her glowing internal organs wrapping tightly around Maya's neck and chest like living, burning ropes. Maya let out a strangled gasp as the creature pressed its pale, needle-toothed face just inches from hers, inhaling deeply as if draining the very breath from her lungs. Leo acted out of sheer panic, grabbing a heavy wooden branch from the ground and swinging it with all his strength, striking the floating heart of the creature. The entity let out another furious screech, releasing Maya and retreating into the dark foliage above. Leo yanked Maya to her feet, dragging her forward as they pushed toward the sound of the distant river. But they had lost all sense of direction. The thick canopy blocked out the sky, and their headlamps only illuminated a few feet of dense green leaves in front of them. They were hopelessly lost in a maze of ancient trees. And the creature was playing with them, her eerie, raspy breathing echoing from the left, then the right, then from directly above. Mark, driven entirely by adrenaline and self-preservation, pushed past Sarah, desperately searching for any sign of the riverbank. He checked his satellite phone, but the screen displayed a complete loss of signal, the GPS needle spinning uselessly in circles. The jungle had swallowed them whole. Suddenly, Leo and Maya's headlamps flickered and died simultaneously, leaving them in pitch darkness. Sarah screamed as a wet, cold object brushed against the back of her neck. She spun around, shining her flashlight up, only to see the Kuyang hanging upside down from a low branch, her milky eyes staring directly into Sarah's soul. The creature lunged forward, her jagged teeth snapping shut inches from Sarah's face. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her back. But in the chaos, Leo and Maya were separated from them. They could hear Leo shouting in the dark, followed by the terrifying sound of wet, tearing flesh and Maya's horrifying screams fading into the distance. Mark and Sarah didn't stop to look back. They ran blindly toward a faint flicker of light visible through the trees ahead. They burst out of the thick jungle brush, slipping down a muddy embankment and crashing into the shallow water at the river's edge. A short distance away, anchored in the current, was Pa Aris's boat, illuminated by a single lantern hanging from the wooden bow. Pa Aris was frantically waving a burning torch, shouting at them in his local dialect to get into the water and climb aboard. Mark and Sarah waded frantically through the waist-deep water, scrambling onto the wooden deck of the boat just as the rain began to pour heavily from the sky. Pa Aris immediately started the boat's small diesel engine, the motor sputtering to life with a loud roar. He grabbed a bowl filled with crushed salt, dried chili peppers, and sacred tree bark, throwing the mixture into the air around the boat while chanting ancient protective prayers. High above on the riverbank, at the edge of the dark tree line, the glowing green silhouette of the Kuyang emerged. The severed head hovered near the carved warning posts, her dangling organs dripping blood into the river mud. She let out one final, frustrated hiss, unable to cross the running water and the boundary created by the guide's warding ritual. Mark collapsed onto the floor of the boat, gasping for air, his body shaking uncontrollably. Sarah wept silently in the corner, staring back at the dark, silent jungle that had just consumed their closest friends. The riverboat sped down the dark water, carrying them away from the forbidden territory, but the nightmare was far from over. When they finally reached a hospital in the nearest town 2 days later, local authorities launched a search party into the jungle, but no trace of Leo or Maya was ever found. Their backpacks, smashed camera gear, and a single shoe were the only items recovered near the carved tribal posts. Mark survived, but he was never the same again. He retired from content creation entirely, deleting his channels and shunning the public eye. However, the most disturbing detail of the entire ordeal came from the footage recovered from Mark's backup SD card, which had remained inside his pocket camera throughout the night. When investigators reviewed the video files, they found a 3-minute clip recorded inside the boat. While Mark was unconscious from exhaustion on the ride back, the camera sitting upright on a bench captured the dark window of the boat's cabin. Outside the glass, pressing against the illuminated window pane in the dead of night, was the pale, wet face of a woman, smiling with sharp, blood-stained teeth, watching them sleep. The tribes of Borneo have a saying that has been passed down for 1,000 years. The jungle does not forget, and the Kuyang never stops hungering. If you ever find yourself traveling through the rainforests of Southeast Asia, and the night suddenly goes completely silent, do not look up into the trees. Do not turn on your flashlight, and whatever you do, pray that the glowing lights floating in the canopy are just fireflies. If a grave in Indonesia is ever dug up by mistake, pray that the knot on the white burial shroud was untied before the dirt was thrown over it. In the heart of West Java, surrounded by dense bamboo forests and mist-covered rice terraces, lies a small village that operates on ancient burial traditions. When a person dies in accordance with local customs, their body is washed, wrapped in a seamless white cotton shroud called a kain kafan, and tied securely at 3 specific points: the head, the waist, and the feet. These knots keep the soul bound to its physical vessel during the journey to the afterlife. But there is one sacred rule that every gravedigger knows. Before the final handful of soil covers the body, the knot above the head must be completely untied. This simple act allows the soul to depart peacefully into the spiritual realm. If the knot remains tied, the deceased person's spirit becomes trapped inside its decaying body, unable to rest, transforming into a restless, bound entity known as the Pocong. This story revolves around a man named Pak Mamat, a veteran gravedigger who spent nearly 40 years maintaining the village cemetery on the edge of the forest. Pak Mamat was known as a hardworking, quiet man, but as he grew older, his eyesight began to fade and his memory started to slip. One heavy rainy evening, a prominent elderly villager named Pak Kuyang passed away. He was a powerful spiritual leader, spent his entire life protecting the village from dark forces, and his passing weighed heavily on the entire community. Because of a sudden torrential storm warning that threatened to flood the burial grounds, the burial had to be rushed before nightfall. In the chaotic scramble to bury the body before the downpour hit, Pak Mamat dug the grave in record time. The wind roared through the surrounding banana trees, blurring his vision with mud and rain. Under intense pressure from the anxious family members standing nearby under umbrellas, Pak Mamat lowered the wrapped body into the narrow trench. His hands were numb from the icy rain and caked in slick clay. In his rush to throw the wet soil back over the grave, he committed the ultimate fatal oversight. He forgot to loosen the top knot above Pakyai Ahmad's head. He packed the earth tight, pounded it flat with his shovel, and hurried home to warm himself by his stove, completely unaware of the absolute nightmare he had just set in motion. That exact midnight, as the storm finally subsided and an eerie silence fell over the village, the curse began to wake. Deep beneath 6 feet of heavy, wet soil, the spirit of the old man found itself trapped inside its own corpse. Deprived of its release into the afterlife, the entity's peace turned into absolute, unnatural rage. The white shroud, instead of rotting away into the earth, began to absorb the dark energy of the trapped soul, turning rock solid and impervious to decay. The dirt above the grave began to crack and heave as something beneath the surface fought violently to break free. The first person to encounter the entity was a young night watchman named Bayu, who was patrolling the perimeter of the bamboo forest near the graveyard. Bayu was carrying a small flashlight and a wooden clapper, whistling to pass the time in the suffocating dark. As he approached the edge of the cemetery, his flashlight suddenly sputtered and turned dim. The air around him dropped in temperature so fast that his breath formed small white clouds in front of his face. Then a sickening smell filled his nostrils, suffocating mixture of fresh graveyard dirt, metallic blood, and sweet, rotting jasmine blossoms. Bayu stopped in his tracks, shining his dim flashlight beam between the wooden grave markers. Standing upright right next to Pakyai Ahmad's headstone was a tall, rigid figure wrapped head to toe in a filthy, mud-stained white shroud. The fabric was tightly bound at the top of its head, bulging out like a tied sack of grain. The entity had no visible arms or hands, as its limbs were bound tightly inside the cloth against its torso. It didn't walk or step. Instead, it moved by hopping with violent, unnatural thuds that shook the damp earth beneath Bayu's boots. With every single hop, it traversed 10 feet of distance in the blink of an eye, moving toward him with terrifying speed. Bayu stood completely paralyzed as the creature stopped just inches from his face. Through the thin, translucent cotton fabric where the head was bound, he could clearly see 2 sunken, glowing red eyes burning through the shroud, accompanied by the muffled, agonizing sound of an old man gasping for air. The entity leaned forward, resting its heavy, cold, shroud-wrapped forehead against Bayu's shoulder, whispering a raspy, distorted plea directly into his mind. "Untie me. Loosen the knot." Bayu let out a blood-curdling scream, dropped his lantern, and ran blindly toward the village center, his mind fracturing from pure horror. He collapsed on the porch of the village chief's house, sobbing hysterically and rambling about the pale, hopping figure that had chased him out of the woods. The villagers brushed it off as a nervous breakdown brought on by the late-night storm, but deep down, the older generation knew the unmistakable signs of a Pocong that had been denied its final release. Over the next 3 nights, the horror escalated from a localized disturbance into an outright siege on the entire village. The entity did not remain in the graveyard. Driven by its endless torment, it hopped through the narrow dirt alleys between houses, looking for the man who had trapped its soul. Villagers locked their doors and boarded up their windows, but the creature possessed a sinister ability to manifest inside homes. Families would wake up in the dead of night to the sound of heavy, rhythmic thuds echoing on their wooden living room floors. They would open their eyes to find the towering, dirt-covered white shroud standing motionless in the corner of their bedrooms, staring down at them with glowing red eyes, smelling of rotting flesh and grave soil. It hovered outside windows, tapping its cloth-wrapped head against the glass pane, crying in a raspy, desperate voice for someone to come out and untie its shroud. Anyone who looked directly into its hollow eye sockets through the fabric was instantly struck with severe, unexplainable fevers and horrifying hallucinations. Dogs in the village refused to bark. Instead, they whimpered in fear and hid under houses as the white shadow roamed the streets freely under the full moon. By the 4th night, Pop Mamat knew in his heart that he was responsible for the nightmare, torturing his neighbors. He was plagued by horrific dreams where cold, decaying hands reached out from beneath his bed to strangle him. He realized his fatal mistake on the night of the burial, knowing that the village would fall into complete ruin if the entity was not laid to rest. The old gravedigger decided he had to face the consequence of his negligence alone. Equipped with an iron shovel, a lantern, and a sharp pocket knife, Pak Mamat made his way back to the cemetery in the middle of the night. The moon was shrouded in dark, swirling clouds, and the wind carried the sharp, icy chill of the supernatural. The moment his boots stepped onto the graveyard grass, the air turned entirely silent. The cicadas stopped chirping, and the smell of jasmine hit him like a physical wall. Standing directly on top of the freshly dug mound was the bound corpse of Pak Yai Ahmad, waiting for him. Pak Mamat dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he apologized profusely to the spirit of the man he had respected for decades. The entity turned slowly, its glowing red eyes burning through the muddy shroud fabric. It didn't attack. Instead, it hopped forward, stopping right in front of the kneeling gravedigger, leaning its heavy, cloth-covered head down toward Pak Mamat's shaking hands. With trembling fingers covered in cold sweat, Pak Mamat reached up toward the top of the entity's head. The white cloth felt unnatural to the touch, cold like ice, hard as stone, and slippery with a layer of dark, foul-smelling grave moisture. The knot at the very top was pulled so tight and caked in dried mud that his numb fingers couldn't loosen the fabric. The entity began to grow restless, emitting a low, vibrating growl that rattled Pak Mamat's teeth. The ground beneath them started to tremble, and long, dark cracks spread across the cemetery dirt as the spirit's patience wore thin. Panicking, Pak Mamat pulled out his pocket knife and sliced through the thick cotton rope, holding the top knot together. The moment the blade cut through the final thread of the knot, a deafening blast of cold air erupted from the shroud, knocking Pak Mamat flat onto his back. The heavy, suffocating smell of rot and sulfur vanished instantly, replaced by a soft, warm breeze that smelled of clean rainwater and blooming forest flowers. From his position on the ground, Pak Mamat looked up through the dark. The pale, rigid form of the Pocong was gone. The heavy white shroud lay completely flat and empty on top of the grass, devoid of any physical body or spirit inside. The soul of Pak Yai Ahmad had finally been freed from its earthly vessel, ascending into the quiet night sky. The next morning, the villagers found Pak Mamat sitting quietly beside the open grave, holding the cut burial shroud in his hands. He never dug another grave for as long as he lived, passing his duties down to younger men whom he strictly trained in every ritual detail. Today, if you travel through the rural villages of Indonesia and ask the locals about the burial customs, they will always tell you the same thing with absolute seriousness. They will tell you that gravediggers double-check every knot 3 times before a single shovel of earth touches the body. Because if a body is buried with its top knot still intact, the shroud will never rot, the soul will never sleep, and the creature will hop from house to house until it finds the person who left it bound in the dark.